Now, it's my honor to introduce the speaker of this evening, Kristine Weber, Director of Subtle Health and Subtle Yoga Professional Trainings. Kristine Weber has been studying yoga and holistic healing for 30 years, teaching since 1995 and training yoga teachers since 2003. She's a certified yoga therapist and the director for Subtle Yoga Teacher Training for Behavioral Health Professional at Mahek in Asheville, North Carolina, and specializes in the neuroscience of yoga for mental health. She's currently conducting research on the benefits of subtle yoga for relapse prevention at a state-run treatment facility in conjunction with the University of East Tennessee. To find out more, you can log on to www.subtleyoga.com. Let me not hold you all from enjoying her talk. Please welcome Kristine. Over to you, Kristine.
Namaskar, Santosh. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. I will share my screen in a moment. I have a PowerPoint to share with you tonight as we get into this conversation about the neurobiology of yoga. I just would like to tell you a little bit about myself too and how I came to this study. So I spent some time, well, I actually was introduced to yoga early. When I was in 6th grade, I had a hippie social studies teacher who taught yoga club after school on Wednesdays. And so I got introduced to yoga when I was quite young. And I even still use some of the practices that she taught us today. I mean, I found something that was very transformative for me. And I knew that it was even at that young age, I knew that I didn't have a context. It was something very important for me in the practices. When I got older, when I went to college, I practiced yoga in college with a real Swami from India. I have no idea where, and thinking back on it, I don't know what order he was from, but he was a Swami who came to my university in Washington, D.C. and taught us yoga. And later, after that, I was so enthralled with the study of yoga that I actually spent 4 years living in Asia and had a couple of trips to India during that time. I spent about 6 or 8 months altogether, in India. Now, when I came back to the United States, I was 1995, and I knew I wanted to share yoga. I knew I wanted to teach yoga. I started teaching pretty much right away. And one of the things that always was challenging was that some people didn't buy it. They sort of thought that yoga was weird or hippie stuff, or, it's not part of the United States culture. Of course, it's not part of American culture, although it is now, but it hadn't been at that time. And so I, very, very curious about if there was any science behind yoga. And at that time, like in the 90s, there were some research studies on meditation, but not a lot that were specifically about yoga, yogic meditation, if you like, more. And really the studies that started to come out in the early 2000s were about mindfulness. And it was in about 2008 or 2009, I was teaching at the Mountain Area Health Education Center, which is probably the most prominent, it is the most prominent continuing education center in North Carolina for healthcare professionals. Certainly mental health is a big part of what they teach in Mahek. So I had started and to mental health professionals so that they could help their clients, and so I was teaching a workshop, and it was about yoga for depression. And at the end of the workshop, a woman came up to me and she said, that was interesting, but I didn't really get out of your workshop what I wanted. And what I found out later is like the brain is actually like Velcro for negative experiences. When you have somebody says something negative to you, it makes you perk up, makes you pay attention. So I paid attention. I thought, well, what did you want? She said, I wanted to know all the science and how yoga works. And that one comment just sent me down a rabbit hole. And that was, like I said, 12, 13 years ago. And at that time, I decided I really need to find out more about how yoga works. And so my background actually is in journalism. I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a journalist. So I curate the research, and a writer. So I curate the research. I mean, I'm really a yoga teacher and a yoga therapist, but that's what I was trained to do. So I started to really look deeply into neuroscience. And what I'm so grateful for is that so much research has been done over the past 10 to 15 years that are starting to prove the efficacy of yoga in a scientific framework. And I think this is really exciting and really important because it helps us to bring the medical community on board. It helps us to bring yoga into the healthcare conversation. And when you think about the amazing, the remarkable, it's not amazing or remarkable, it's actually tragic healthcare outcomes in the United States before COVID. 90% of healthcare dollars go to chronic, largely preventable diseases. 6 out of 10 Americans have at least one chronic disease. 4 out of 10 Americans have two or more. And what is the best medicine for chronic disease? Would you like to type in the chat box? I know some of you know that answer right off the top. Feel free to type it. I'm just giving you a little drum roll here. Lifestyle medicine, right, is the answer. So that's what, and this isn't like my idea. This is what the specialists in the medical field are saying is lifestyle medicine. People like Dean Ornish, for example, that lifestyle medicine is what we need to address chronic diseases. And what is the best lifestyle medicine? You know this if you're on this webinar, it's yoga. I mean, yoga is the original lifestyle medicine. So let's go ahead and look at some more slides here so we can get into this topic in a little more detail, because as you understand the neuroscience of yoga, you can understand why it's so important to talk about in terms of health and healthcare. Okay, I already talked about all these things about myself. I just wanted to give you a little introduction. If you want to find out more about my work, you can go to subtleyoga.com or email me at support@subtleyoga.com. Also, I have a free class that you're welcome to use, and feel free, if you don't get the URL right now, feel free to just go back in the video and I'll show it again at the end. But this is a class you can check out, because what's really become a passion for me is sharing with folks how you can use yoga to benefit your brain and nervous system. Because when the brain and the nervous system are working well, we see that the mind works well. We see that there's more balance in mental health, and really mental health is one of my deepest interests in terms of my teaching yoga. So I thought, since this is Vivekananda Yoga University, I thought I would start with a love from the esteemed Swami Vivekananda, and I'm such a great admirer of Vivekananda and certainly Ramakrishna. I visited the Ramakrishna mission a few times when I was in India, and just enthralled by the mysticism and the greatness of this tradition. And Vivekananda wrote, "The sage is often ignorant of physical science because he reads the wrong book, the book within, and the scientist is too often ignorant of religion because he too reads the wrong book, the book without." And so clearly what Vivekananda was saying all those years ago, more than 120 years ago, was that we need both science and mysticism. When we can create the link, the bridge between science and mysticism, not only do we have validity for our assertions about yoga, we also have something that appeals to the heart of so many people, practices that expand the heart, that expand the capacity for compassionate love and empathy, which is so desperately needed in our world. So I want to start by defining yoga, because in the United States, unfortunately, yoga often gets defined as exercise. But actually, and we can take this right from a research article, that yoga is an integrated system of ethics, asanas, pranayama, and meditation. This comes from Tim Gard's article called "The Potential Self-Regulatory Mechanisms of Yoga for Psychological Health." And it came out in 2014. It's not like, this isn't any sort of, surprise to anyone, I'm sure, that's watching this. What's relevant is that it's a research definition that includes ethics and the operationalizing of our values. And that, I think, is a really important and perhaps even groundbreaking inclusion in terms of looking at the research. Yoga is clearly a holistic system. We can't just look at how, someone's stretching their muscles and call that yoga, even for research purposes. So I like to start by unpacking my terms. I'm not only talking about asanas, I'm talking about the 8 limbs of yoga. And then I thought I would just take a moment here. I mean, typically it takes me like 3 or 4 days to unpack all this material. I've got 45 minutes today, so just a real quick look into the brain structure and function. What is the brain for? Most of us think it's for thinking, right? And that's usually what you think, the first thing you think about with the brain. But the brain does a lot of other things besides think. It also is responsible for all of the autonomic activity in our bodies, for example, breathing, balance, heart rate, metabolism, digestion. Your brain is doing all that stuff, in different parts, mostly the brainstem and midbrain, but different parts of the brain are involved. And then the other big thing the brain does is it moves us around. It helps us to get around and to get out there into the world. So we use it's for moving the body and utilizing, and the senses are part of this, of course, too, the gyanendriyas and the karmendriyas, as the yoga tradition talks about them. So this is from Dan Siegel. Dan Siegel says, hey, you can change your brain. By the way, Dan Siegel was not the first person who said this, but the scientific community thought for 400 years that the brain doesn't change, right? So it's only been, about 30 or 40 years we've started to understand that there are parts of the brain that are plastic. And this is very exciting, not only for stroke recovery or traumatic brain injury recovery, but also for psychological health and well-being, and certainly for the health and well-being of the nervous system. So there's many ways of the brain change, but this is just one model that I think can be useful or helpful when we use repetition. That's kind of the language of the brain, right? We all know that when we hear things over and over again, that's how we learn them, right? That's if you want to be good at tennis, if you want to be Serena Williams, you hit that tennis ball a gazillion times, right? So repetition is important for changing the brain. Emotional arousal or passion is very important for changing the brain. You have to be interested in something. If Serena Williams wasn't interested in tennis, she wouldn't be good at it. So you have to have a little passion for it too. And then novelty, because when there's certain things that are new, we perk up and pay attention to it. That's why we want to buy new cars and new clothes and things. And focus and awareness, perhaps that should be the first bullet point, because it's such an important point in terms of our understanding of the brain. I just got a message that my connection is unstable. So can somebody just let me know if things are working okay? You can put it in the chat box if you like, or come on and let me know. I'm assuming things are okay. All right, let me know if you don't, anyway, I'll keep going, but let me know if you don't hear from me. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is that, well, if those things, by the way, if those are the 4 things that ways that your brain, I'm just looking at the chat to make sure. Audio's been a little wavy here and there, but generally okay. Okay, thank you, Patricia, for letting me know. I did the went off in my house and the power went out, so I'm using my cell phone as a hotspot. So I apologize for any problems with that. Okay, so yoga and neuroplasticity, when you look at those 4 ways that the brain changed, I think about those all the time with yoga. One of the things one of my yoga teachers says is do the same thing, do it differently. There it is, repetition with a little bit of novelty, right? You have to be interested in it. You have to have that passion to be interested in it as well. So and certainly focus and awareness is a big part of the practice. So then I think about, like, okay, if these are the ways that change the brain, then how does yoga? And I thought I would start with this quote from Helen Lavretsky, who's at the Semeli Institute, behavioral health, you say. she says that in a way, both yoga and meditation, which I always like cringe a little bit when I hear both yoga and meditation, because meditation is part of yoga, right? Yoga is brain exercise. They're brain exercises that engage different parts of the brain on different components of practice, right? Breathing, movement, postures, chanting, visualization, concentration, all of the yoga practices affect the brain, but in different ways. They can help the brain form new connections and recover from injuries, or as we call it, stimulate neuroplasticity. So this is a model from a research article by Mira Balasubramanian, who was at Duke University at the time. And she was looking at, it's called Yoga on Our Minds. I want to show you a bunch of different articles here. So, well, not a bunch, but a few. And she looked at all the different components. These are 8 limbs of yoga, right? She looked at the 8 limbs of yoga, and she's looking at, so what happens to the brain? What happens to the brain with these 8 limbs of yoga? Okay, so the first thing that she starts to look at is the Hpa axis. Now, if you leave with nothing from this webinar, other than understanding that yoga helps to downregulate the Hpa axis and the stress response and cortisol, then you've taken away something very important. So there's ample evidence in robust research that shows a reduction in cortisol from yoga practices. So this is very important. Hpa axis means your stress response, the stress response part of the nervous system, right? The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We also know neurotransmitters are the way that neurons communicate with each other. The nerve cells, neurons communicate with each other, nerve cells in the body, neurons in the brain. And so we know that there's these different neurotransmitters. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but we know GABA. That's a big one. GABA is the brain's chief inhibitory neurotransmitter. So when you're stressed out, you don't have enough GABA. When you feel chill, there's GABA. We know that GABA increases with yoga practice. We know that serotonin increases. You might know serotonin. That's considered the happiness neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine decreases. Norepinephrine is like the adrenaline of the brain. When there's a threat, the brain, the locus coeruleus, sends out norepinephrine. And acetylcholine, which is really important for movement, it's involved in muscles, brain to muscle communication, increases. So lots of good things are going on as you do yoga practices. We also know that the neurotropic factors, which is BDNF, is a way that it's a substance that keeps the neurons alive. We know that increases. That's a good thing. But there's other research that shows that telomeres, which are the ends of the chromosomes, actually lengthen from yoga practice, which like all this is implying longevity, right? So it's a good thing. Like it's good to have your neurons functioning better. Also, we know that there are certain parts of the brain that change, like the prefrontal cortex, and lots involved in thinking, executive function, the hypothalamus involved in hormone regulation, the amygdala has a lot to do with the stress response and looking for danger. And they know that shrinks a little bit, the actual less gray matter with yoga practice, which is good. The locus coeruleus, which I talked about before, that's like it's a little blue place deep in the brain that releases most of the norepinephrine for the brain. And then the hippocampus gets more gray matter, which is actually exciting too, because that is meaning that memory integration is better, and it's involved in the stress response in some ways too. And like when your hippocampus is a little plumper, it just means that you're not as stressed out in general, as state or trait stressed out. And then increased vagal outflow, meaning that there's good vagal tone, and that has a lot to do with the stress response too. The vagus nerve is the largest nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system. When that's functioning well, it means you can be more in that parasympathetic homeostasis. All of this takes us to the outcomes: less depression, less anxiety. Depression and anxiety went through the roof with COVID, right? There was an increase. I think the numbers are something like 40% increase in depression and anxiety. Decrease in negative symptoms, increase in cognition, sleep, and attention. So I love this chart because it's kind of simple in some ways, and yet you can really go down the rabbit hole with every part of this. So I highly recommend checking out her article if you haven't already, the Yoga on Our Minds article, because it's just gives a really nice systematic review of all the research that's out there. Of course, this was done almost like 8 years ago, right? So there's much more research that has come out in the meantime. And I think we're just going to continue to see all this positive scientific evidence that helps us to, validate what the ancients have been saying, that these practices are so important for humanity. So this is from going back to Tim Gard's article. I wanted to show you, I took his model and then I made it a little simpler to make it kind of a little more graspable. So he says you've got these he calls them process tools, the four of the, and it's all the 8 limbs of yoga, but he squishes them into 4 process tools. And he says you have both top-down ways of changing the brain as well as bottom-up ways of changing the brain, right? So those top-down ways of changing the brain result in decreased stress and increased resilience. So you have things like better memory and attention and awareness and moral cognition network, better reappraisal and setting goals. So that's a top-down way of changing the brain. So the neuroscientists always talk about this top-down, bottom-up, and the top-down is like the front brain and the cortex and like using cognition. So when you think about like cognitive behavioral therapy, that's the way you change from the top down. But one of the challenges is that top down doesn't necessarily get to the deeper parts of the brain, which are less plastic and harder to make changes. But yoga also does address some of the bottom up ways of changing the brain, which means like from the lower parts of the brain, the brainstem, the midbrain. And so we see like the vagal system, the vagus nerve, which again is the largest nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system, has a lot to do with, actually the very involved in respiration and the heart rate as well. And so anyway, that you think about those things as being under conscious control, right? They're not top down, they're coming from the bottom up. But we know with yoga practices, including, shifting your breathing, when we know that when you're breathing out, there's less activity in the locus coeruleus, right? The part of your brain that has got the adrenaline going. So there's less of that. We also know that when you breathe out, your foot comes off the vagal brake. It's not that your foot's ever on the vagal brake, that's just a metaphor. But what it means is that you get more braking there. And that means, again, more of a parasympathetic response, which is that's inspiring, and we know that over time, I'm going to show you some other slides in a moment. Over time, we start to make more concrete changes in the system. So let's remember, like, you can practice yoga once and have a nice experience, but repetition changes the brain. So when you practice yoga regularly 4, 5, 6, 7 times a week, you start to make more neuroplastic changes that they actually can see in the functional MRIs. What's all this about, by the way? Top down and bottom up changes? Is this there's one more thing here, somatic processing. This is so important. I don't have time to really unpack it, but the somatic processing means it's sort of like thinking about your body and mind coming into better parallelism so that the body believes what the mind says, if you want to think about it that way. You can think about that in terms of introspection and cardiovascular function. Most of them can start to percolate. Well, certainly proprioception and balance can start percolating up, and interoception very much percolates up into consciousness. Okay, I'm just going to stop for a moment and make sure. Hello? It said my sound is dropping out. I just want to make sure it's okay now. Feel free to put something in the chat box. I'm very sorry that there's no internet at my house because of the storms. Sound's dropping out a lot. Oh, still in and out. Sound was getting laggy. Okay, if we can just pause for a minute, I am going to see if my internet connection is back on. Let me see if I can do that for a sec. And then I can just switch over to my regular internet. I hope it's back on. Sorry for the delay here, folks. Can you still hear me? Am I still on? Yeah, feel free to type a question or a chat while we're figuring this out. Is this better now? My internet connection? Yes, I'm fine. Okay, good. So sorry about that. Okay, let me share my screen again, and we'll go back to this. So hopefully you can hear me better. I apologize for that. So it's just the reality of our times, right? Okay, so anyway, all of this ends up like, what are the research benefits of yoga, right? So what does that end up looking like? So what's the functional, like, what does it look like when all that stuff changes? Well, it means you have pro-social behavior. That's important. Like, you play well with others, right? You get along with others. Psychological health increases and physical health increases. So this all comes from the Tim Gard article that I referenced earlier, if you want the citation for it, okay? All right. So now this is another rockstar article that I'm really excited about. It's from the National Institute of Health. It came out in 2015, and it's called The Neuroprotective Effects of Yoga Practice, Age, Experience, and Frequency-Dependent Plasticity. This was a really groundbreaking article because these wonderful people, Chantal Villemure and Catherine Bushnell, who's amazing, and the other, certainly the other, these researchers are rock stars in my mind because they are helping us to understand what really is happening during yoga practice. So they looked at a bunch of different brains and what they said of people who practiced yoga and people who didn't. And what they found was that yoga practice increases parasympathetic activation. So just going back to that, just remember, parasympathetic means that kind of rest and digest stage of the nervous system where you're relaxed and chill, right? It's different than the sympathetic. It's not antithetical to, but it's different from the sympathetic activation where you're in that more of a fight or flight stage, or at least activated, not necessarily fight or flight. Okay, and they also found that yoga increases gray matter in the left forebrain, the left hemisphere. When there's more gray matter, the researchers say this correlates with self-regulation, that capacity to regulate your nervous system when you've gone out of your window of tolerance. That's another Dan Siegel idea. Like, you go out of the window, like, oh, something is not right and I'm freaking out and I'm yelling at my kids or whatever. With yoga practice, you have better capacity to go back into self-regulation. You can still yell at your kids, but it's not as, it's not an all-time, not an all occurring event, right? Positive affect, which means, people generally have a more positive outlook and a more positive personality. And, affect means sort of like the way that you are in the world. And then pro-social behavior again. So this idea that, plays well with others. So this left forebrain is actually very important. Don't get confused by some of that stuff you hear about the right forebrain being better and more creative. The research is very, very clear that this left gray matter dominance, or more gray matter in the left, there's a lot of research on it. It tends to correlate with these greater self-regulation, positive affect, and pro-social behavior. Yoga may also decrease gray matter in the amygdala. The amygdala is kind of like the smoke detector of the brain that's always looking out for trouble. And so that correlates with less fear and less reactivity, less anxiety, you could say too. Okay, so then there was so much more from this study. This is it was quite in depth, but I just wanted to give you the highlights from it. The next thing I want to talk about is dedicated spiritual practice, because as we know, this is a very important part of the yoga tradition. Meditation is a very important part of the yoga tradition. When I say spiritual practice, it could be meditation, it could be chanting or kirtan, or puja, I mean, there's many different ways that people engage spiritually. So I don't want to define that here, but it is certainly and has always historically been a part of the yoga tradition. And so this research comes from Lisa Miller at Columbia University. Again, like, I'm so grateful for her for this research because it's really mind-blowing. She did 2 studies, and one of them she showed that people who had a predisposition, meaning they had a genetic marker for depression, and they value spirituality, and she controlled for religion. This was not about people going to church. This was about people valuing their spirituality, that they have more gray matter. Thicker is kind of a misnomer, but it's like more gray matter in the cortex, which then that would correlate with like better self-regulation, positive affect, pro-social behavior, right? And executive function. And then these are the specific brain regions she cited: the parietal occipital regions, the sial-frontal lobe of the right hemisphere, and the cuneus and the precuneus of the left hemisphere. Those are all really specific, and you can read the article if you want to go into more details. I don't have time to do that right now. But the last point is the last bullet point is that she did a second study and found that people who, right, was having more gray matter in the cortex, what she found is that these people have a 90% decreased risk of developing depression. Can you imagine if Johnson & Johnson could model that? They would like make a fortune, because there's nothing out there that, and this also makes us understand that depression is not simply a matter of brain chemistry gone awry. It is a holistic human experience, and we have to address all aspects of human existence, including spirituality. And so many people in the West are terrified really of talking about spirituality, and yet it's such an important part of human existence. So we have to find ways of talking about it that are non-sectarian and don't freak people out. I live in the South, so I get it, Okay, so when I saw somebody raise their hand, we are going to have time for Q&A. I just want to finish the slides first, so I'll definitely answer questions. Okay, if I can. Okay, so how does yoga change your brain? So I put this little chart together based on Chantal Vellamure's study. And so we know that there are some functional changes and some structural changes. I said I would talk about that, right? So we know with yoga practice, what's one thing that happens with yoga practice? Well, people become better at awareness. And I would also put focus and attention, although those are different things, but they're kind of related. Awareness. People become more aware of themselves, of their bodies, of their environment, of their relationships, and how important this is, right? Between stimulus and response, there's a chance to, this is Viktor Frankl, there's a point of awareness, of reflection. It's so important. Like, I think about all the wars in the world and how much, and all the arguments and conflict, and how much people need this awareness. And now where this shows up is in the prefrontal cortex and Brodmann's area 10, which are parts of the brain that have a lot. I mean, I can go into more depth on that, but the basics here, just for time wise, it's like has a lot to do with executive function and evaluation and behavior regulation, like thinking before you do something. I have a 17-year-old, so we talk about awareness a lot, like just be aware of leaving your dishes in the sink. You know what I mean? Like, that's something teenagers have to develop, and we can never stop developing. We can always develop more awareness, right? And the next two are interoception and exteroception. There's so much more than just the insula, but that's one part of the brain that we see shifting. The insular cortex is a cortical island. It's kind of deep in your brain, the side, on both sides, and has a lot to do with receiving messages from the body and then making sense out of them, so you have a better idea of who you are. You have a better understanding of who you are. It has a lot to do with identity, and that identity that comes from knowing where our body is. Exteroception has a lot more to do with, like, where is your body in space and what's going on outside of you. It has to do with proprioception to some extent, but what's going on outside of yourself. The sensory motor cortex is really interesting part of the brain, right on the sides here. Of course, this is where the sensory cortex is taking the signals from the body. They get processed through the thalamus and other brain parts and then come up to and then the motor cortex is when you send those messages down. So, you get an itch and the message goes, something, and then you scratch it, right? That's a simple explanation of sensory motor cortex. That's so much more than that, but that's kind of the basics of it. And we see that there are structural changes there from yoga practice, more gray matter in the hippocampus, which has a lot to do with memory integration in the hippocampus. There's some very fascinating studies on it. It's one of the most plastic places in the brain, so you can see an increase and a decrease pretty easily in the hippocampus. We don't know, scientists don't really know where memory lives in the brain. I suspect it doesn't live in the brain. As a yogi, I suspect it lives more in the subtle body, but is interfaced with the brain interfaces with it. I'm sorry if I just offended any scientists out there, but there's very little evidence that there are actually like pockets of memory. Like there's no microchip in your brain. There is a hippocampus that helps us to process memories, and it's very important in terms of the stress response, because when you can access those memories that tell you you're safe, then you don't get freaked out in any kind of situation. I always use the example of like you're walking down the street and you see a stick, and your brain goes, oh, it's just a stick, and it looks like a snake, but you're like, no, that's not a snake, it's just a stick, because of the hippocampus is telling you you've had that experience before. The fourth one is the functional changes is better self-regulation and emotional regulation, and we see that played out in changes in the anterior cingulate cortex as well as the orbital frontal cortex. The orbital frontal cortex is kind of a mysterious area. It's sort of related to the third eye area, and the scientists are a little bit still, the jury's out on what exactly it does, but it does have something to do with self-regulation and emotional regulation. And then the last part it's not the last part, but one of the last parts, the last big one I want to talk about is the corpus callosum, which is the white matter that connects the hemispheres, like gets the hemispheres to talk to each other, because you might have a memory over here in your right hemisphere that's more imagey, and then the left hemisphere makes the language out of it, and they have to talk to each other to make sense. And so some of the stuff we're going to do tonight, I'm just going to do a tiny little practice because I hardly have any time. That tiny little practice is going to be corpus callosum based mostly. Okay, so I want to say just a couple other little things before we finish up and do a little practice. Slow, mindful asana practice. I'm a huge fan. And that's how I was taught when I was in India. That's how I was taught from my Bengali teachers, from my South Indian teachers. Slow, mindful, pay attention. Why? Because it builds awareness. Awareness is the key to change, right? This is, as I mentioned earlier from Dan Siegel, one of the 4 keys to change is you've got to start with awareness. Awareness is what distinguishes asana practice from fast exercise. So all of that fling yourself around vinyasa that's out there and really popular in the United States, and sorry if you're a big fan of that, it's great exercise, that's great, but it's not necessarily the way that the brain changes. It's not necessarily good for the nervous. Slower movement leads to more subtle observation and map differentiation so that more change is possible. Okay, so a couple of tips for using asanas. If you're an asana person, how do you use them to affect neuroplasticity? Slow down and use interoception, which means pay attention, use awareness, openness, curiosity, a lot of awareness about how your body is feeling in the moment. Exploratory novel movements. So don't always do the same asanas, or do the same asanas, but do them slightly differently, right? That's really important here too. Okay, let's see. Someone asked me to go to the previous slide because it was frozen while I was talking about it. I'll go back. If you have a question, I'll go back, okay? Because I do want to make sure we have time for a little tiny bit of practice. Use your movements with your breath, because we have a ton of good research about how slowing down your breath also is beneficial to the nervous system. So then you combine that with movement and you really catalyze the effects. And cross-lateral and contralateral movements are great, and the yoga world, the yoga practice is full of them. So we're going to practice. I just want to make sure you saw that. Yeah, and my website. But grab the class if you want to. Grab the URL for the class. You can always take a screenshot. And I'm going to stop sharing, and then we have like 3 minutes. At least we can do something. Okay, so I think maybe I need to highlight myself here, spotlight myself. Okay, is that all right? Can you see okay? Okay, Santosh said we have 6 minutes, so that feels like wonderful. That feels amazing. And then we'll have plenty of time for comments too. I mean, for Q&A. So get comfortable. By the way, you don't have to stand up, but you can if you want to. I think we'll just do a few things with our hands and feet, little contralateral stuff. Contralateral means opposite arm and leg. And cross-lateral means crossing the midline whenever you do that, right? So a simple practice here would be inhale, take your right arm up, and maybe all the way up over your head, or maybe just lift it this high. It's up to you how much you want to do it. Exhale it back down. And then left arm, inhale. Nice and slow, and pay attention to the sensations as you move. Exhale down. And then right arm, left leg. And maybe you reach all the way up, maybe you don't. And here's what I'd like you to do. Instead of just going through this leg, right arm, left leg, left arm, right leg, try it. Imagine that you have a string connecting your hand to your foot, and you're doing that with a breath. And the inhale lifts everything up, and the exhale lowers it all back down. And then imagine you have a string connecting your left hand to your right foot, and as you breathe in, it lifts it up. And then when you exhale, you lower it down. You see, that's so different than just like lift it up, lower it down, right? So, and you can do that with so many different postures, so many different postures. If you get my brain class, you'll see lots more of this stuff. But let's just take a moment, do one more, right hand, left leg. And then exhale down. And then left hand, right leg. Okay, now what's really nice to do after doing some of that contralateral stuff is the integration. Try both arms, both legs. Imagine that your brain is communicating, both hands, both feet, or imagine that it's the hemispheres are connecting now. Because you do want to do some symmetry after the asymmetry, because it helps to integrate the effects. Now, another couple other little interesting things you can do. For example, take your arms out to the side, breathe in, and then give yourself a hug, one hand on top, the other one down, lower your chin. So it's kind of like an eagle pose. And then inhale back up. I work with a lot of therapists and a lot of healthcare professionals, so I'm always interested in practices that are accessible, that anybody can do, much more so than the elite athlete stuff. So this is a good neck stretch, but you're also getting the contralateral movement. Or cross-lateral, sorry. Contralateral and cross-lateral together are called cross-crawl. So that's a couple examples. Anything that you're doing where you're increasing your exhale, where you're lengthening your exhale, is another really great way to tap right into the parasympathetic response. So like a forward bend or a twist pose naturally lend themselves to that part of the breath, like a longer exhale. So any of those poses that you can do and gradually lengthen your exhale will take the nervous system into more of that parasympathetic response too. Okay, so I see that I only have a few minutes left. I know that we have a bunch of questions. So, I can keep talking, but I think it would be better if I answered the questions.
I have the first question that came in from Raji, who asks, how is self-regulation defined in yoga?
Oh my goodness, isn't that what all of the texts are about. I think it's defined in many different ways. I guess if you look at Patanjali, you know that the vrittis aren't spinning as much. You know, when I think about coming more from like the Bhagavad Gita perspective, I think about having an equal balance of karma, jnana, and bhakti. You know, I think there's so many different ways you can talk about it, but I think that the Indian tradition is actually has more information about self-regulation perhaps than any other, you know, than any science has really understood yet. So it's a really good question. I don't know, maybe somebody else who's maybe one of the other, I don't know, Santosh, if you want to answer it, but I think there's many different ways you could look at that question of self-regulation in yoga.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Patanjali actually starts with Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So that's his
Yeah,
opening stance on the thing. And
right.
yoga actually goes ahead and dissects from that point on, and it shows you, what needs to be achieved, how it has to be achieved, and what are the powers that you're going to gain after it's achieved, and then the final stages.
Mm.
So yoga is all about that. So it's
Yeah.
that would be the nutshell.
Thank you. That was great. You did Patanjali in 30 seconds.
All right. So next question is Tina asked this: how are you defining the mind? It's not the brain or merely thoughts.
Very good question. The mind and the brain, that's something that the neuroscientists struggle with a lot. And I would suggest that the mind and brain are very different things. The mind uses the brain and the body to inform and to change the mind. So they're different. In my opinion, there's a lot of neuroscientists who say simply the mind is what the brain does. I disagree with that. I think the mind is a product of, and then I think the brain is a product of the mind, actually. I would look at it from that non-materialistic perspective, that that the brain comes into being and the body comes into being based on these impressions or these samskaric impressions that bring us into existence, that compel us into this world. So I do think that they're quite different, but they, you know, you can't have one without the other. Anything else? Oh, I can't hear you, Santosh.
We need to cover a poll. I forgot about the poll. Sorry about that.
Oh,
So please
okay.
answer the poll. It'll be just a few seconds.
Okay. I think I got there were some interesting chats about the brain is actually considered part of the body in yogic culture. It's part of Annamaya Kosha. Yes, thank you, Arun. That's exactly right.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next question. This one is from Elise. If one had a very physical practice versus a meditation, pranayama, hatha, or yin
Mm.
style, is the parasympathetic nervous system still deeply affected?
Uh, so I think it's a really interesting question, and certainly we know there's a ton of research about how exercise is great for the body and the mind and the brain, like, and the nervous system, you know. So there's a ton of research about how exercise is great. And I put that kind of yoga in the exercise category. Like, there's a ton of research on about how it's really important for aging. You know, it's important for all aspects of health. Exercises, we've known that since 1969. when Dr. Kenneth, I think his name was Kenneth Cooper, came out with his book Aerobics, right? So 1969 onward, we've had more than 50 years of very rigorous research of the benefits of exercise. What we've only started to discover in the past 10 to 15 years through researchers like Norman Farb, Eric Sunin, these guys are researching interoception and the benefits of mindfulness in the body and how that impacts the nervous system and health. It's new research. And my opinion is that in the next 15 to 20 years, we're going to see so much more, and we're already seeing it, but we're going to see so much more emphasis on active relaxation, which is not the same thing as Netflix and wine. It's that's passive. Active relaxation where and using asanas to be able to widen this window of tolerance, which means you bump up into the sympathetic nervous system with harder practices and stronger pranayamas, and you bump down into the parasympathetic nervous system with the softer practices and the softer pranayamas, right? So we need both of those things for sure. I'm not convinced that yoga is the best way to get your cardiovascular exercise needs met. I think walking, running, and all of that stuff. And if you want to do like strong practices, that's great. But you should also complement it with this new information that is starting to emerge that's saying you've got to go inside and tune into what's going on. And you can do that, as I mentioned in that one slide, with that slow mindful awareness. It's really, really an important piece, I think, of the puzzle of health that I think is going to start to emerge.
Okay. The next question comes from Arun. He says there is a lot of research going on in India as well on yoga,
Yes.
like at Patanjali Institute. Do you have any studies from India to share?
I have so many studies, particularly from Shirley Tallis, who's, she's at Patanjali Yogapita. And there are so many studies from India. So most of my presentations are in the United States. That's why, and I'm deeply sorry if that is offensive. I didn't mean to be offensive, but most of my presentations I do here. So because of that, I use the NIH research whenever I can, but I'm very aware of the amazing research that's going on in India, and very impressed by so much of what's come out. So yeah, and that's where the first research was done. Kevalyadam, was the first place they were doing research on yoga therapy. So it certainly is very important research, and I do have it in bibliographies. I just didn't have it in this presentation, so I apologize for that.
Hina Bhatt asks, what's your experience with Kirtan yoga?
Oh, I sing kirtan every day. And I spend a lot of time singing kirtan in India, and in I have a meditation group, and we sing kirtan usually weekly. And my son and my husband like to sing with me. So yeah, kirtan is very important to me. Thank you for asking. I love kirtan.
Raji asks, how do we find more such exercises that you showed towards the end of the session, or any books?
Yeah, please, books, sure. You can, I'm just looking over there at my bookcase, but one of my teachers is Gary Kraftso, and like Kraft like the cheese, so like the seeds, Kraftsow, and he has a book called Yoga for Wellness, and you will find many things in that book. And also, I highly recommend that you check out my free class, because it's all about optimizing the brain and the nervous system.
Next question. So there are a couple of questions regarding the last slide. So people want to see the last slide, but let's just quickly cover the remaining questions.
Okay.
So to Hina, do you have a PhD program? It's in the works. It's not currently offered, but it is in the works. I think the idea is to check the VaYU website and look for more information over there. Raji asks, she's just made a comment. Prakash asks, how do you define consciousness?
Oh my goodness. Well, the yoga tradition defines the four states of consciousness, right? The being awake state and the dreaming state, and then the deep sleep state, and then the turiya, which means that state of like pure consciousness, that pure awareness. So those are four states of consciousness. And I think those are from the Upanishads. So, in terms of I really think those are beautiful definitions from the tradition. But I think it's important to think about consciousness as, and what's a functional, practical application of consciousness. I think it's important to think about consciousness as both macrocosmic and microcosmic. There is a flow of consciousness from the universe, and human beings are I want to say kind of like the human form evolved in order to house that desire for ever expanding consciousness. So the human brain, when we go back to that brain mind thing, the brain has to be all folded over, and it's the size of like, I think they say the cortex is the size of like 4 sheets of paper, and it's all folded over and stuck in your head, and it has to have so many, it has more neurons than most other animals. I think there are some whales maybe, or dolphins, that have as many as we do, but I could be wrong about that. I think it's 84 billion or something neurons, trillion, I don't remember exactly, but the human brain had to evolve in order to house the desire for consciousness, which is the desire of the universe, right? The desire of the universe to recognize itself and then to merge back into that cosmic oneness. So, yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating conversation I would love to have with you. I'm not sure I can define consciousness, but I do think the yoga tradition does a good job of sort of explaining, and some of this, like Sri Aurobindo's work, I think is fascinating on consciousness. I think there's many different ways we can go with that question. But I think it's very interesting in terms of brain science, because why is the human brain so special? Is it special? I think it might be. But why does it seem to keep getting bigger? And that's because that desire for consciousness, that desire for expansion, that desire for limitlessness that exists in all beings.
So,
I hope that's
making
interesting.
answer. So before we go to the slides, the last set of slides, a book, Chitra asks a book name, please, with author.
For what? Is this going back to that question about?
Question about
Okay.
where to find such exercise.
Yeah, so I'm going to put it in the chat box, Yoga for Wellness. And that's from Gary Crufso, who studied with Desikachar many years ago. Yeah.
Maria asks, are you aware of Dr. Satbir Singh Khalsa, a renowned yoga researcher?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I've met him a few times, actually. He's doing great work. Did he come?
Yeah, he had given a talk as well.
Good. Yeah, he's great and has done a lot of really good work for promoting. I mean, he's just like Mr. Advocate. He's always out there pounding the pavements, advocating for yoga and healthcare. So he's great, doing great work.
Okay. Great. So you can go ahead, and if you want, if you have the time, it's at 6:06 right now. We have a few minutes. So Kristine, you want to go ahead and talk about those last slides?
So somebody wanted to see the last slide. Okay, let me see. I'm not exactly sure which ones you wanted to see, but I'm happy to put it. Got the last 2 slides. Okay. Let me go down here. Oh, these guys. Oh, just so you know more information about me. Was it this one?
No, I think the previous.
Okay. This one. Oh, these last 2 slides. Okay, so those are my tips, but I'll start with this one from Norman Deutsch. I'm wondering if this is one you wanted to see.
I think so. This one and the next one.
And this really speaks to that question about why should I also do a slow practice? So yeah, do fast. If you like fast asanas, like the thing I love about asana practice is it's so malleable. And there might be times in your life you want really stronger, hard exercise. Great, like yoga can do. And with Ayurveda, our understanding of Ayurveda, people need different things. So do it. That's great. And add a little bit of slowness into your practice too. For all those pitta provoked people out there, we definitely can use some more slowness, right? So I hope that was good. Take a screenshot if you want. And then the last one I want to show, or the second one was these are some of my tips, some of my ideas, and the things I've been teaching for a long time in terms of helping folks to affect this neuroplasticity, right? So repetition, novelty, awareness, and passion or interest. Those are the things that really change the brain. So that awareness, that curiosity, and by the way, the neurobiologic counterpart of curiosity is dopamine, right? And you hear dopamine all the time. Dopamine is that neurotransmitter that they always often talk about in terms of substance abuse, right? That the dopaminergic circuits get hijacked by the substance abuse. So bring your curiosity into your practice, find something interesting inside that can kind of help to increase the dopamine. At least that's my theory, that it will increase the dopamine production. So anyway, I hope this is helpful. I'm happy to leave it up or take it down. Let me see if there's anybody wanted to ask. Thank you. That's the one you wanted to see. Okay.
There's Santosh Kumar with us. Did you have some experience in some very unique cases during your neurobiology for yoga research projects? Please share some cases with us.
Oh, you mean people that do you mean people that I've worked with? Is that what that means?
Yeah, if you had some experience, some unique
Oh,
case
yeah.
that involves neurobiology
Oh,
and
sure. I've worked with a couple of people. I've worked with two different people who had traumatic brain injuries. One of them over a long period of time, and he still has cognitive challenges, but he uses yoga as a way of, and he's getting older, and he's using yoga as a way to maintain function at this point in his life. So it's really been exciting to work with him. And I've been working with the clinicians at a state-run treatment facility right now. And we're looking at if this kind of work is like, we're doing a study right now. Is this kind of asana practice helpful for relapse prevention? So I've worked with lots of people with drug and alcohol challenges over the years. I just one off the top of my head, she, we did yoga together. I worked with her with yoga therapy weekly for about 6 months. And she finally told me at the end of that time that it had helped her so much to stop smoking weed. So that was really inspiring to me. And then, by the way, like smoking weed for some people is very medicinal. I'm not saying that's not everybody's goal, right? But that was her goal. She felt like it was an addiction for her, and she was able to let go of that with yoga practice. So, and I have so many other stories, but I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Kristine, for sharing that.